Well, first off, I just want to say welcome to all you lovely people to the How the Media Covers Race panel. We're all real ecstatic to have you here with us virtually tonight. My name is Charles Clark, and I am a columnist at the UT, where I write about issues related to race, identity, civic life, I guess justice a bit as well. Um, I want to applaud you all for coming out and engaging in what I think is a really essential discussion to have, and one that'll hopefully shed some light on how journalists approach many of these difficult issues related to race, and just more broadly how news media and newsrooms play a role in helping communities be more inclusive. I think there's going to be a lot of interesting insights that you all will get from this. I know that there's going to be a lot that I'll probably be learning as well. We have some awesome panelists. I'll be introducing them shortly. But before I do that, just a kind of few things to cover my bases. One, I wanted to thank the San Diego Public Library and the City of San Diego Communication Department for hosting the Media Literacy Series. News literacy, I shouldn't have to say it, but it's of great importance, period, but especially I think over the past decade or so, with the proliferation of misinformation and disinformation, whether it be online and social media, through elected officials, through some organizations that present themselves as news media. The whole point is, right, it can get a bit sticky, I think, deciphering a lot of this. So it's really cool to see a series like this going on. And I also think beyond that, for all of us in newsrooms, this is something I think all of us are constantly having conversations about, is how can we better convey to readers and viewers how we actually do our jobs and why we make the decisions we make. So thank you for engaging. The other kind of quick thing I just wanted to touch on is for all the journalists in the audience tonight, I wanted to give you a heads up that there's going to be another really cool event going on next month. It's a workshop hosted by San Diego State University that'll focus on how journalists cover race as well. And essentially, it's going to run for 3 hours on that Saturday. It's going to feature a keynote address from Dr. Meredith Clark from the University of Virginia. And it's going to cover a variety of topics related to how we cover race, including implicit bias and microaggressions, getting out of your comfort zone, and frankly, just what you need to know, learn, and things like that to become more informed about other cultures that we're going out in the community to cover. So with that, I just kind of want to welcome our panelists, and a gentle reminder to all you guys throughout this discussion that you can submit questions throughout or through the chat. That's the only way we're going to be seeing your guys' questions and responding to them. So please throw them in there, because I'm sure we'll work them in throughout, but also just in general, we really want to cut out some time at the end of this for a Q&A. So first up, and I think you can probably already see everyone, but just kind of quick intros. First, I want to welcome Lindsey Winkley, who is an investigative reporter with the San Diego Union-Tribune's Watchdog team, someone that I'm very blessed to call a colleague and a friend. Prior to moving over to Watchdog, she also spent years covering crime and policing. Her work has been recognized by the Society of Professional Journalists, the San Diego Press Club, and others, and she recently published a really exceptional series looking at disparities in policing, which I could not stress enough to all of you that you should go out and read it the moment this panel is over if you haven't yet. So thank you, Lindsay. And then—
so much for having me.
We also have Mayashree Krishnan from The Voice of San Diego. She is an associate editor for civic education with Voice. Prior to assuming her editor role, Maya also reported on immigration, the US-Mexico border, housing issues, and education in San Diego County. She is also co-director of the Asian American Journalists Association's Voices student program. So I think she brings a really fascinating perspective to this and just a breadth of experience that we're all going to gain from.
Thanks for having me.
Also joining us is Melissa Adan, who is a reporter and anchor with NBC7 San Diego and Telemundo 20. Her investigative work into sex abuse and mismanagement of funds at the San Diego migrant youth shelters was recognized in 2019 by NAHJ with the Al Newharth Award for Investigative Reporting, I believe. And she also went to Tijuana in 2018 to cover the migrant caravan. And a lot of you probably see her on your TV here most weekdays, I would think.
Thanks so much. Welcome, everybody. Appreciate it.
Also joining us is Christina Kim, who is the racial justice and social equity reporter at KPBS. Her work combines data-driven research with, on-the-ground street-level reporting to really take a close look at a lot of these issues. Prior to joining KPBS, Christina worked with StoryCorps, Reveal, from the Center for Investigative Reporting, as well as NPR's Here and Now, where she reported on homelessness and immigration and housing. And which I thought was really cool when I found out, when she worked at KQED, she also helped the Truth Be Told advice show, as I understand it, for and by people of color.
It wouldn't be 2021 without someone forgetting how to unmute. But hello, thank you so much for having me.
And last but certainly not least, we also have Otis Taylor Jr. joining us. He is the KQED News Radio Supervising Senior Editor of Race and Equity. I hope I got that right. He recently rejoined the station after working at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution's investigative team, and he's also worked at the state newspaper of South Carolina and as a columnist for the San Francisco Chronicle, where he investigated police violence in the Bay Area Police Department, mistreatment of ICE detainees, and corruption in Oakland, among other things. And some of you might have caught him on United Shades of America recently.
Hey, thank you for having me.
Awesome. So I guess I was hoping we could kick this off, and maybe I guess, open to all our panelists, but I'm kind of curious with our editors and some of the management level here. I guess I'm wondering, in what ways do you think local news outlets are succeeding in covering our diverse communities? And in what ways are we coming up short? For anyone who wants to lead off.
All right, I'll start. I feel that race is this thing where news outlets don't really want to touch it. But at the same time, I feel that race and equity is baked into every story that we do because it is baked into the story of America. I feel that, let me just give you an example. In Atlanta, where I currently am, a white man went on a shooting spree and killing Asian American women. The police immediately say, oh, it's not a hate crime because the shooter says he has a sex addiction. Well, one, this country for far too long has taken the police narrative, particularly when the police have shot Black men. And two, it was disgraceful that journalists in the Atlanta area, even the national ones that came down, that reprinted that police officer, just a gunman, a white man bought a gun and the same day kills people. That is what we should be talking about instead of what his reasons were. Well, at the AJC, our big Sunday story, we chose to victimize the victims further by writing that Georgia legislator has been trying to close down these spas, these parlors, these places of ill repute. Well, that's unfair to the Asian American community, many of whom see these places as places of healing and not necessarily what we, when we center whiteness in our coverage, see them as. But furthermore, I feel that that incident is something that we as journalists have not really reckoned with, that when a story breaks, we often lens it in the context of how white people are going to respond to it, when this country, as we know, is more than white people. I think someone needs to mute. Christina, shout out 2020, still forgetting to mute, right?
Yeah, thank you, Otis. That actually kind of lends itself to another question that I have. And, I'm wondering in particular related to AAPI hate, right, which we've all seen a surge in over the past year. You know, one kind of question that I think I've seen some people raising about just how the media is covering this topic is, does our lack of consistency and kind of the lens that we're looking at it from, does that reflect underlying issues in how we cover API communities absent of hate? Maya, would you love to jump in?
Yes, I would. Yeah, I mean, I grappled with this a lot in the past few months as a lot of after Atlanta, when a lot of news organizations started looking at ways to cover anti-Asian sentiment and hate incidents throughout the country. And it made me really realize that my news organization and a lot of news organizations in San Diego in particular just don't really cover Asian communities that often at all. And that was something that was really difficult for me. I'm not East Asian, so what's been happening a lot, it hasn't been something that has personally impacted me, but it was definitely, to sort of look at, well, we never really pay attention to these communities at all, and particularly in San Diego, they're not small communities. We have quite a large AAPI community in the county and in the city, and I don't think we cover them anywhere near, proportionally in any way. And I had been hoping that that incident would be a sort of wake-up call for many reporters and news organizations that we need to start paying attention more to these communities. And it so far hasn't really been that, but I think that that's a big thing. And kind of going off of Otis' point, I think that during breaking news, a lot of news organizations do frame things in a certain way, and that's continuing to happen. And in the API context, I noticed it recently with what's going on with India and the big COVID-19 outbreak that's happening there. I saw a lot of news organizations, including some here in San Diego, start referring to it as like the India variant, and there was the first India variant case in San Diego and things like that. And I think sort of one, we're framing things around a white point of view, and that can actually be really dangerous for a lot of communities of color. And it sort of can create a sense of isolation from the media. And then on top of that, if we're not covering these communities regularly, that's also a big audience that we're losing. And I think particularly in a place like San Diego, where the fastest growing populations are Latinos and Asians, like, we're really not doing ourselves any favors by not writing for those communities and not writing in a way that resonates with them.
Thank you. That kind of makes me think kind of along those lines, right? I think we look at, we've had a lot of events over the past year that I would think would be wake-up calls for us as an industry to really examine how we cover just frankly all our diverse communities and a lot of these issues. But along those lines, I guess I'm curious about what are the efforts that your respective outlets or you as individual journalists are trying to engage in to kind of better, illustrate what's going on in these communities and get more of those voices involved in the conversation. Maybe Melissa, you want to kick us off?
Most definitely. Good evening, everyone. This is a topic I feel very passionate about, so I'm glad to answer this part of the question. For instance, just so you all know, I work for NBC 7, and I also work in Spanish language media, so for Telemundo 20. So I am a bilingual news reporter. It's something that I never understood because I grew up speaking 2 languages. I grew up born and raised in Miami. So I think that this is normal, right? In my childhood, in the culture of Miami, living with my Cuban, Dominican neighbors, my Puerto Rican neighbor, my Haitian friends, that was just life for me. When I start to traverse the country for my journalism career, you start to obviously learn the rest of parts of just America, right? and that makeup of America. So for the majority of my career, in June, I'd been 5 years with NBC Universal, and I've always worked at a station that is also a duopoly. So it works with Telemundo and NBC hand in hand, meaning that every day our coverage, we seek to cover and interview folks in another language. So today, for instance, when I met an individual that spoke English, I was at a vaccine clinic for San Diego Unified School District. And this goes back to Otis's point that every single story you cover, culture and race is totally integrated in every story. And that is the opportunity that every journalist has and every viewer has to take that in. And if you don't see that, you're missing it, because that's why we have different journalists, because it's our lived experience being told through a different lens, and then we're sharing it. And that's, the art of storytelling. So we're at this vaccine clinic, and I first there was the principal and then a nurse, great, so we can get English interviews, see what was going on. Then we meet a young woman who is, first of all, I was so impressed that she was phenomenally bilingual. She gave us an interview full English, and then she gave me an interview in Spanish. A lot of the other press obviously also interviewed her in English because she was fantastic. Her viewpoint, she took her mom there. It was just cool. Then I get to interview her in Spanish, and this is my personal skill. I talked to her in Spanish, and then I'm learning more and more about her, little tidbits or little nuggets of information that no one else got, and we're all standing in, the same spot, and she's sharing to me because she speaks Spanish. So then I'm already furthering the story, and then the story already just immediately looks different. And I could grant you that the story that aired on NBC on the English side just had maybe a different tone to it, because I really focused on a young woman that lives in City Heights that decided to get the COVID-19 vaccine. And because of her, she influenced her mom, who's an essential worker, and brought her there because her mom's been so hesitant. And so the very easy, simple example, because I think my story today was just a regular assignment, but it shows that culture and race is always going to be part of your assignment. And we shouldn't be scared of it. I think newsrooms have the opportunity to not be like, oh, that's a race issue, so we need to segregate it. We're actually doing it a disservice if we do that. We have to be very open and willing that everyone in our newsroom is okay to talk about it. Everyone needs to think about, when I go out to a story, who's the first person I call? And at my station, I'm proud to share that at NBC and Telemundo, we promote that we call different people, that we make sure that it's not always a white man doctor that we're putting on television, because that does perpetuate a stereotype into our community. So there's a lot, it's like, there's so many people of color that hold professional jobs. And so by the time that we start doing that, and you see that on your air, it represents the community. They're hands down. I go out into our community, and I can find so many people so easily that are bilingual amongst the lines of English and Spanish that I know, but beyond that, there's so many other cultures here that people speak multiple languages. And if we find that on a day-to-day basis, that's so representative of our community. So you do have to try. You have to, when you go to that vaccine clinic and you get one interview, you're gonna have to try again to get it more representative of our community. And so those are personal efforts that we, at least at my station, do. I think it works for me because that is my lived experience. But then I've also been pushing myself, learning about other cultures, learning about other communities, and that's how we get better overall.
Love it. I guess kind of along the same lines to a degree, one thing that came up in just some of my conversations that I've had with different, diverse communities, and I actually believe it was someone from the Latino Community Foundation who made a comment to me about this, is there is a tendency at times, I think, for a lot of news organizations to cover marginalized communities from kind of a single issue lens, right? So if you're Latino, it's like immigration, right? That might be how they think of it. Or, with Black people, they'll go to police or something like that. I guess I'm wondering, is that one, and I guess I direct this to Cristina, given your focus of your work, is that something that you see out there in coverage, and how do you try to get past that and dive a little deeper with your stories?
Sure. Well, I'm very new to the beat and I'm hearing what everyone's saying. And actually in my job interview, I said the very same thing you're all saying. Like every single story is a race and equity story. If you're really looking through it, this is the work of an entire newsroom. But to what you just asked me in particular, I'm thinking more just like it is about sourcing. So I'm thinking about, during this summer's protests, I went out, I was in Los Angeles and it was a predominantly Latino march in support of Black lives, protesting, George Floyd's death. And I made a point to interview someone in Spanish about what they thought and why they were marching. And I think it's important to remember, to your point, that everybody is part of the community and that they have perspectives and that they are also kind of processing what justice means. And so, yeah, bringing in, to your point, like a Latina woman to talk about why she was protesting, what she thought about police violence, but not just for an immigration story. Like, I think that's important. I think we have to think about our communities as diverse and then go to them for what they think about everything, because to your point, if not, it becomes incredibly single issue. And I have another, oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I'm harking back to what Otis said in the beginning and just we pulled out a few little threads and then we just moved on in terms of like how, especially the response to the murders in Atlanta and how we just took the police line about this sex addiction. And I thought, man, like if we did have editors of color, if we had Asian editors who are rooted in what it means to be Asian American in this country and Asian history, we would know that this rhetoric goes all the way back to 1875 and the Page Act, in which Chinese women, Asian women in general, they're not allowed to enter the United States because their bodies are seen as desirable, as if they're pretty much marked as sex workers with no evidence. And so you see that through line and you carry it all the way to 2021. And I just think if there are people, there should be stopgaps in our newsrooms, not only in the journalists, but in the editors who are just tuned in so that because I think at the end of the day, when you're covering race and equity in this country, you have to have a very firm understanding of how power works. And you have to be really, really rooted in what history in this country is, because the history of the United States is the history of power.
Maya, you looked like you were going to add something to that.
Yeah, no, well, I was also going to say something about understanding history, both of this country. And I think that every reporter on every beat needs to understand how, the history of the different communities that are at play in their beat, which are usually like every community in the geographic area that they're covering, but also, how race was built into the system that we're covering, because every single beat is a system and race is built into a racial hierarchy is built into every single system in this country. So whether you're covering healthcare or education or, public safety, there is a history there is a structure there, and that's something that you need to understand. And then going back to, what reporters and newsrooms can be doing. I think that it's really important to get to know the communities that you're covering, and that's not just through data, but I think it's really important to be on the ground and understand certain things. So I'll use like the API example because I think it's like the most blatant example. I think a lot of reasons, or one of the main reasons why it doesn't get covered a lot, is because if you look at API data, they don't really seem like they're doing as badly socioeconomically or educationally or anything as other communities of color, particularly Black and Latino communities and Indigenous communities. But like API includes a lot of different nationalities, a lot of different languages, and a lot of different histories in the US. And so sometimes some of the immigrants who came in the 70s, who were quote unquote high skilled workers, who came under a different regime, they have a very different experience here than communities that came at different periods, or, communities that came for different reasons. So in San Diego, like the Indian community here has a very different experience than the Vietnamese community or the Filipino community, but they're all clumped in to one big data point, and you'll never see any individual experiences, even when they're really bad, if you don't actually get on the ground and start talking to people. And I think that is true in, pretty much any ethnicity and community. Like even within the Black community in San Diego, there's like, a Black community that has its roots like all the way back to slavery. And then we have a really large Black refugee population. And there's certainly some overlap in their experiences, but there's also really big differences in their experiences. And to really cover race well and to really cover these communities well, like you really have to take the time to get to know all of their experiences. Otherwise, you're kind of just painting them all with a big brush. And it doesn't have to be like as, I guess, egregious as like thinking Latinos are all like immigration issues, but like really just recognizing how complex they are. Because if you think about that, we never really do that when we're writing about white communities. We write about like how the community feels in like this particular neighborhood, or about like this particular issue. And when they're coming to city council to talk about it, we write about it with so much more nuance than we ever do when we talk about communities of color.
Thank you. And I appreciate you guys throwing questions in the chat. We're about to rope some of those in, but kind of along those same lines, I was hoping to turn to Lyndsay real quick, especially as a Watchdog reporter. I am curious about how you are approaching broadening coverage and, as kind of come up here, getting into more of the nuance with a lot of these stories, especially, the investigative accountability pieces.
Yeah, I mean, you probably know this as well. I think our paper has put a lot of energy into doing a better job about covering race in a more equitable way. And I will say that, this is kind of unrelated to that question. I'll get back to that question in just a second, but I think that it's really important for media organizations to acknowledge that we have done a tremendously poor job over the years of reporting on communities of color. And I think that those and continue in a lot of ways to report poorly on communities of color. And I think that that's really important to acknowledge, because that is going to color the way that any of our coverage is received by communities that we haven't done a very good job in being balanced and reporting holistically. And I think specifically when we're talking about the Black community in San Diego, if you think about the kinds of coverage that you generally see about communities of color, especially the Black community, we're talking about a lot of crime. We're talking about, a lot of instances of trauma. And that is going to further color those communities in a negative light and kind of stack on top of the existing challenges that they face. And I kind of bring that up because none of that goes away when we all focus on doing better, right? I think that it's important that, that's the foundation that we're sort of trying to make improvements on. But that being said, as far as kind of the watchdog kind of roles at our paper, I think that we want to challenge sort of the traditional narratives. I think that the comments that have been made by other panelists about kind of taking the police line is such a huge thing, because we do that all the time. We're very rarely, kind of in the past, I think that not as much as we could have, challenging what people in power say, particularly about minority communities. And so that's sort of been one of our focuses, is making sure that we are taking deeper dives into issues that deserve greater attention. And that's kind of, what we decided to do with this whole the racial biases series that we just did.
Thank you. Well, some great questions popping up in the chat, and one I want to go back to, especially because it's kind of something that I think was touched on earlier by Otis, is Alyssa posed a question, and apologies if I mispronounced your name there, but her question was, how can white journalists frame stories differently? How do we learn not to center whites? It's one thing for BIPOC journos, but what about white journalists? Otis, you want to start?
Sure. That's a very good question. So my job that I just started today is focusing on how to lens race and equity into the forefront at KQED, a large station. And part of that is working with the editing structure, because if you look at Newsroom, most of your editors are white and they're white men. So there's a problem right there. And when I mean equity, I don't mean just racial equity, I mean gender equity as well. And so you try to ask reporters, and I see it as more reward reporters, to look at things differently. For instance, if you write a homeless story, obviously we notice that most of our homeless population are Black and brown. Ask the question, why? Don't just tell me another camp popped up or another incident with a homeless person. Ask the question, why are people homeless? When we talk about race, we need to also talk about the wealth gap in this country. You know, that dates back to slavery. And when we talk about guns, that's something that's close to me. I know anytime I write about racial inequities, you know, invariably I have white people, well, what about Black on Black crime? And then I respond, well, do you think police are actually going to stop the murders from happening? You know, every news organization did stories last year about, even the Chronicle, rising murder rates. And it pissed me off because no one's answering the question that, why is this happening? The guns aren't manufactured in Black neighborhoods. How are the guns getting there? What is the pipeline from the manufacturer to the dealer to those neighborhoods? Why don't we intercept that? Police are not going to respond to the underlying issues that cause crime, and that's poverty, that's lack of opportunities, that's lack of education. And when you wonder why that is consistent in these poorer neighborhoods, it is white supremacy, because that is the system that enacted the rules that suppress people of color. And so I would tell my white colleagues, and this is what I will tell them, is to be more curious. And if it takes you an extra day to get a deeper story, well, then that's what we're going to do, because we are going to provide our audience more context. And I think in this age of misinformation and disinformation, we owe it. As journalists, it's incumbent upon us to provide our audiences with deeper context of the stories of the day. I'm not a hot take person, so I'm not going to be the same way as an editor. I'm going to slow it down, and I'm going to demand that we add context to our stories.
Thank you. Another question that popped up in the chat here, and it kind of builds out the question about how do we go out and do all these things. Nick M asked, with limited resources and newsrooms, how do you convince the powers that be the importance of these issues and make them balance that with the daily news needs? Melissa, given you mentioned some of the stuff NBC has engaged in, I was hoping you might share a bit about how you do that, especially with the turnaround, I know, for broadcast journalists.
No, it's a great question. And yes, for anyone, any journalist, we're all under deadline. So there is always this like quick turnaround of information granted. But just like Otis said, some stories need a breath. And that is where you yourself as a journalist have to stand up and speak. I'm very fortunate. I have an excellent managing editor who gets it. So as of the last year, you know, there has never been an issue. I also think that it's career development. Personally, I think I've also found my voice. And that's very honest. And when you say that to any journalist, especially what range you are in your career, journalists who have been around for a long time have been around a lot of different editors and a lot of different styles and are adjusting again. And of course, this is cyclical. Newspapers, the way we consume news has evolved. And if we're all sitting here, 2021, in 10 years, the way we all consume news, it's going to change again. And we all have to adapt with it. And so I say that by making sure, okay, so what do we take with it when it comes to what we stand up for, what we speak up about, what we share, et cetera. You know, some things just become also part of the mandate, right? So for us at our station, it's just like requirement, get a Spanish language interview. That pushes other journalists at my station that do not speak Spanish. They go out of their way to interview people in Spanish. That's just an example of how are you efforting this on the ground. That comment that came up by posted just here in the chat by SDABJ, it's so true. Like we need to go out there before there's a press release or before there's a camera to then respond to a community. I've been successful when that has happened to me. And then when it's not, then you're kind of stonewalled, you know why? And you're like, well, I've got to start from scratch, building my, contacts if I just got to this neighborhood where there was this crime, this accident, this issue. And there are always issues to follow up. Follow-ups, so big, right? Whatever was a big headline, what we can revisit again. That's another way then to add more context to the story that you thought, this missed something. Well, you can work on, like a perfect example is work on turning your first story that day, but make sure you follow up on it. And then you have that extra context. And then that's 2 stories that you're supplying, the daily news grind with, but then with added context that then also continues helping, because people will click and people will follow up themselves because they care about the stories. So to sum that up, it's just within you, pitch for follow-ups, and just by asking and everyone being involved, I think is also really key. The fact that we're having a conversation like this, it does matter. Thank you.
I see another question that popped up in the chat, and I think, Lyndsay, you touched on this in some. I wanted to hear more about what you think about this. Kelly Davis posed the question about, should newspapers get rid of the police blotter page? It tends to be written quickly, and it's based on police version of events. It also the place in the paper that can perpetuate stereotypes about race and crime. Thoughts?
Yeah. First, hi, Kelly. I think that that's a really interesting question. That is routinely an area where there isn't as much time to do follow-up on. Sometimes it's something that you get towards the end of a print deadline and you're just kind of throwing it together. But I think to Otis's point, I think that that's going to be up to each news organization. How much do you care about getting the story right? Like, how much do you care about making sure that you're going one step deeper? Because how often have we written a story, in 10, 15 minutes because it's something that's breaking, and 3 hours later, the story is completely different. I think that that's always going to be a challenge in journalism. And so I think that media organizations have to sort of figure out, where is that fine line? And if you are going to write about a story, commit to it. Don't just write 7 inches and then never revisit it ever again. If you're going to put it into the paper, stick with it. Make sure that you get the information that you need. That being said, I do think that there's been a lot of conversation, at least at the UT, probably at other organizations, about things that we don't write about anymore, and also how we phrase those things. So I know that when I first started as an intern at the Union-Tribune, the way that we would identify individuals who were suspects in cops briefs was not necessarily as stringent as it is now. So now we have to have a lot of detail about a suspect in order to put those individuals into a story. At least that's what I was before I moved on to the Watchdog desk. But I think the idea behind that was, we don't want to add to the narrative of a particular group of people being repeatedly criminalized in newspapers, right? Because that's what you see. And so I think that all of those things are things that you really have to weigh carefully as sort of a news group. But I think kind of the bottom line is, how committed are you to making sure that you're telling the truest story you can tell? And if you're committed to that, then you should be able to follow up on those little things to get a better version of it.
Thank you. And guys, loving the questions you're throwing in the chat. Keep it up. We'll try to get to as many as we can whenever they pop up in there. One thing that came up in here, and I'm scrolling back through, I saw David Myers brought up just how staggeringly people in the LGBT community are impacted by homelessness. And I think it actually begs a larger question too about, how do we incorporate the LGBT community more into our coverage? I'd love to hear some thoughts, maybe Christina.
Well, it's interesting, like LGBTQ, and the minute what I just thought of, I'll just say what I thought right away is like, well, I think what you're saying is we need to be more intersectional. Like when we're talking about people of color, are they part of the LGBTQ community? Like homelessness disproportionately impacting people of color in San Diego and nationwide. That probably means data-wise that that means that it's also potentially LGBTQ youth of color. And so I think, yes, to your point, it's about, and to what Maya had already said, it's about thinking about these communities in all of their complexities and all of their diversities within the communities that we're covering. And it's also an equity issue. I mean, I think it's the same way that we're covering racial groups is the same way we have to think about LGBTQ in the sense of like equal opportunities to employment, to housing, to, you know, acquiring wealth and health. So that's just what I thought. It's like, it's not an either or, it's an actual like together, and then like, let's find out where those intersections are and maybe where they diverge. And then we'll have a more nuanced conversation.
Yeah, I think too, I would just kind of add to that. I mean, I think that it was something that we've said before that, you know, race and culture are so often a part of the conversation. You know, sexual orientation is also often part of the conversation if we take the time to look for it. I think that, you know, when we're talking about sort of exploring some of these more, you know, issues that were traditionally seen as prickly by, you know, media organizations, I think that there is a lot of opportunity to tackle those issues. We just don't as often as we could.
Well said, guys. Well, I guess, you know, one broad question I do want to get into. Sorry about that. One kind of broad question I would love to hear some thoughts on is just, we talk about a lot of the issues, right, in the news media and how we kind of need to go about changing it. I guess there's also that question of how do we build trust, right, with communities? You know, obviously there's a great deal of hostility and mistrust of news organizations right now, and it's not just from the fake news crowd, right? And I guess one thing I'm just kind of wondering is, what would you like to see news organizations do to build trust and, you know, improve just kind of our relationship with readers or viewers? And Maya, I'd love to hear your thoughts, given I know Voice has such a loyal following.
Well, I really think that having a conversation with your audience is really important. And Voice San Diego does have a loyal following. It is not a loyal following that is fully representative of the county demographically, which is something we need to work on. But I think that being out there is really important. I think that the more that people see reporters in their communities and the more used to having them they get, and not just when something bad happens and people are like parachuting in, but having them there consistently, you know, like having them sit in regularly at community meetings and consistently calling and checking in with people and actually forming, you know, that source relationship that we work really hard to cultivate in a lot of other regards. I think that that needs to be done. I think that also a lot of conversations that change the power dynamics between reporters and a lot of these communities also need to happen. Once that, where, you know, people's rights are laid out really clearly, where people's understanding of what a news article is, what it can do, both negatively and positively for someone who's speaking to someone, are really important. I think all of that is just really crucial when it comes to trust building. People need to know where you're coming from, and they need to know that, you know, when you're having a conversation with them, when you're interviewing them, what that means for them. Because it can, I think oftentimes reporters go into a lot of, you know, marginalized communities, which tend, you know, which are often communities of color, and they perform a more like extractive form of journalism where they sort of just like take people's stories and there isn't sort of an exchange of information. And there's this power dynamic, to Christina's point earlier, that's, you know, long been there, that maybe the reporter it may not be aware of, and that plays into how someone's speaking to them or how they expect a story to come out or something like that. And I think we really need to work on leveling that power dynamic to kind of help build trust with those communities.
Really quick, if I could jump into Maya's point about the responsibility. Right now, we also have a responsibility that social media influences our coverage, not the coverage, but the reception. And for instance, I bring this up because I have an example. I did this story about this family who hosted a party and they all got sick with COVID-19. Their grandfather passed away. We did the story, it aired. They were, thankful about our thoughtful coverage, etc. But what happened on Facebook was not okay. On Facebook, everyone was commenting, saying all of these degrading comments about this family, that I immediately flagged it. And my news director told our digital team, we're taking it off Facebook because we do not need to berate this family for this experience to get what Facebook clicks or links. And, that's kudos to my news director that leads and thinks that way, that actually, considers the community. And that I immediately flagged it and said, this doesn't feel right. I don't like it. That's important that we say that. And so that's just a quick example of who, gosh, the things that we've seen online now, that's a huge also fallback that we see. So there's the story still up, that's fine. They like the story, it was done respectfully, but then there's also this, it goes on threads and things that people need to be aware about, that, yeah, you share something and you're just going to be out there for so many to judge and see.
Yeah, that kind of makes me also think a bit about just in general, right? Anytime we write about anything related to race, immigration, crime, you're more likely than not, right, going to get a very interesting, I guess will be the word I'll use, reception in your inbox, let alone on social media. I guess I'm wondering for all of you guys out there, just how do you navigate that as a journalist, right? And make sure that that doesn't, dissuade you from doing anything or influence your coverage in any way, but also just how do you write in a way or report in a way to break through to people who may not already be on the same side of these issues? I guess, Christina?
Hold on though. Before, I have to give a shout out to you, Charlie, and you were talking about how to build trust, and I had raised my hand. I just want to, and I will answer or attempt to answer your question. But I think something that you did in your column actually did help build trust. You recently went back and you responded to letters that you had gotten based off your column. And you shared, and you can talk more about this is your column, about how after you wrote about certain topics, people wrote to you and it changed your mind. So you were having a conversation with people, and maybe these people didn't agree with what you were saying, but then you actually took the time to write a column in which you responded to them and engaged with their ideas. And I think I'm actually answering the question the more I think about it. So one, it's just like, yeah, that's how you build trust. But then that open dialogue with the people who don't agree with you, that's how you get them receptive to you. Oftentimes I will find when I get those emails, if I just respond, thank you for reading or listening, and thank you for your comments, as long as it's not like racist or egregious and they're really, engaging with the material, then I think that's how you leave your door open and you don't shut people out unnecessarily. There are moments where you have to do it for safety and for just, reasons. But I think that's how you do it. You keep the conversation open, even with folks that don't agree with you. And I just want to do a quick little side thing too. I know you're asking about people who may not be agreeing with you, but something that just came up while we were talking is, and the role of editors is, I have never once had an editor ask me, well, if an immigrant is reading this, how do you think they'll perceive this story? That has never been asked of me. It's never been asked, hey, if you're living in a community of color and you're covering this policing story, how do you think they're going to respond to this story? That's just never been asked of me. But I'm often always asked, what do you think people who think that gang members are horrible and don't deserve to have any kind of rights? How will your piece speak to them? And so I think that's a power dynamic we need to break down here too. It's like people who don't agree with what we're writing about, but then also like, whose opinions do we value and center, and what's the imagined audience?
I really love that point because, this is actually something that came up recently at the Pointner Power of Diverse Voices seminar One kind of issue that someone posed was, and that was a group of, journalists of color, and they were, getting into this discussion about why is it that I always have to code switch, right? Things that people from marginalized communities, they're going to know exactly what I'm saying, but it's always written with the lens of a primarily white audience. And I guess for our editors, how do you get through to management, right? That it's okay for reporters to come at this from a different lens. Maybe Otis?
That's interesting. One of my first stories that I wrote for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, I had a white male editor tell me that it is not a fact that people of color have been marginalized and oppressed in this country. And his position was that I was editorializing. And I said, no, it's backed up by President Biden now. At the Democratic National Committee, he began his acceptance speech, acceptance of his nomination, with a quote from Ella Baker, who, if you know anything about the civil rights movement, you know how instrumental Ella Baker was. And her whole point was about the marginalization and oppression of people of color. But my point to this editor was, why are you so certain that that's not fact? How can you call yourself a journalist in 2021 and not acknowledge that this has happened or has happened in our country? I didn't take the time that I should have, because I was working on another story. I was working on the white insurrectionists, many of whom from the Atlanta area. I think it's on a one-to-one basis. I expect at KQED that I will have some resistance or some hesitancy from editors who have been doing a job and reporting the news one way for so long. And we have to understand that when we're talking about systemic issues in our society, that includes the profession of journalism. I understand that I'm going to have conversations with them and walk them through it. But it's the same that I feel that I do with readers or listeners that come take this walk with me. But I bring data, I bring facts, and I bring this empathy to my reporting, but also to my relationship with my colleagues, wherein that you're reporting or you're editing in such a way, but empathize with the content that you're producing. And if you empathize with that content, I think you will do. I think you would use more resources to produce that content, and part of those resources is adding perspective. And we can always go back to the police. I'm not going to have that happen. Like, we're not going to publish a story with just the police narrative. That holds no value in journalism and society right now, because the police have proven they will lie about anything, everything. And unless we can corroborate, there's just no need for it. Because if you look at, for instance, Rayshard Brooks in Atlanta, I don't know if you remember that story, but this was, soon after George Floyd was murdered. We have to say he killed, but you can say murdered now that the officer was convicted. But Rayshard Brooks was a man in Atlanta who had fallen asleep in his car, and police roused him, and they're trying to arrest him. And he's trying to get away. He fights his way out once they try to put the handcuffs on him. And so they shoot him in the back. Well, in the immediate aftermath, because police know what the climate is in this country, they release to the press that he has a criminal record, that he has a kidnapping and child endangerment charge. But when you go back and look at the police report, this kidnapping and child endangerment charge stems from the police putting that charge on him, putting those charges on him, because he was defending himself while he was being attacked by someone, grabs their arms, and there's children present. The police see that and they add those charges. How often does that happen to people of color in this country? It's incumbent upon us to set that record straight. This is how I will explain it to editors that might have a problem, Charlie. This is how I will explain it to reporters that might have a problem. Like, are we really about doing our job? Are we really about that life? Or are we trying to front? And if you're trying to front, you can get out of my newsroom.
Thank you. Lyndsay, I just realized I missed your hand up earlier. Do you have something you wanted to add?
Well, I did want to say, you know, when we're talking about just overall sort of how we make connections with communities and how we better cover race, I think that it's important to say that we all as journalists need to take a serious look at our own implicit and explicit biases. And we need to make sure that we are doing the work to be anti-racists, right? I mean, and we all have work to do on that front. And if we really want to cover race better, I think that that needs to be a priority for every journalist, but I would say specifically, particularly, we'll say white journalists.
Thank you, Lynn. So, you know, one other question that seems to have popped up here, and sorry, I think we're running down to, we probably have like 10 minutes left or a little less. Just having too much fun talking to y'all. But, you know, one thing that came up was Gabriella raised a question of if more can be discussed regarding the issue of data versus the claim of editorializing when it comes to issues of race and social justice, as well as when standard facts are actually editorialized / minimized. I'm not sure who out there would feel comfortable tackling that. But Cristina, I'm going to put you on the spot just because I know you do a lot of data-centric work too.
I just want to think, this is my first thought. I'm always going to go with my first thought. When I hear editorializing versus data, what I'm hearing is actually someone questioning whether a journalist of color is objective. And that is a very different conversation that is a particular experience of journalists of color. If you're too close to it, or you're perceived too close to it, then you're editorializing because you have some kind of end goal. That's when I hear, are you editorializing data? And I think we've seen, that was another racial reckoning that we've been seeing in the past 5 years, where you're seeing journalists speak out against that and say, no, I'm actually covering these protests, these issues fairly. I, however, do have a vantage point. I have a perspective as someone who lives in this country that has my skin, that has my gender, that has my background. And the reality is that objectivity lens is only put on journalists of color and never white journalists. It's the same way that we're saying, hey, let's take the police at their word. Well, let's take white journalists at their word. Let's just not question their background because their background is normalized. They are not the other, but somehow journalists of color are. And so the way that we are approaching is somehow not objective, because objective is really just code word for white. That's a little different. I think there's more to that question that's being asked that I will let somebody else, because I think there is something to be said where you can take facts, right, numbers, and take them out of context and not explain what they mean. I think Maya almost hinted at it, right? You can miss a lot of API stories because statistically their numbers aren't large. But if you dig into the data, you will see that there's one of the largest wealth disparities within Asian Americans, right? So that's not editorializing. I think that's just data needs context. And then the second thing is like data alone won't change people's minds. If you routinely just show people that inequities exist, there have been plenty of studies that show that like readers and listeners just start to normalize inequities. And I even read a recent study from like Kellogg Insight from like 2020, and it was about the racial wealth gap. And they did studies of like white readers, and they found that people who were reading about the racial wealth gap in its historical context, it didn't help them understand why there was a racial wealth gap. In fact, it made white readers feel that the country had actually progressed, because reading that history, they just assumed that things had gotten better, because that's how ingrained the progress narrative is. I bring that up only to say like numbers won't won't change minds. I think that was really convoluted, but that's, hopefully someone else can clarify that.
Well, if anyone wants to jump in, I mean, it also sparked another question for me that I was hoping to pose, but go ahead, Maya.
I just have one thing. I think that there's been a big focus recently in the past several years on like data journalism, and I think it's really important. But I also think it's really important to understand not only limitations of data, but like it's the biases that exist within data. And that it is our job to sort of correct for those things and keep an eye out for those things. And when I think about, and I don't know if this was like the purpose of the question, but I've seen it a lot from law enforcement agencies, like for example, the district attorney's office or something like that will put out like, gang crimes were X percentage of all of the murders or whatever. And they just put that one single number out and it's like perpetuated in a bunch of different ways and story articles and like tweets and all these things. And it leaves out a lot. It leaves out like a big chunk of where, the rest of the murders were caused. It leaves out like, it just leaves out a lot. And so I think that like you have to be really, really careful with data because it's often even used as a weapon against journalists to kind of control some of their stories in some ways or shape some of their stories.
Wait, I just want to jump in there. Yes, yes, yes. Like, I feel like the other thing is that people think that data is objective, and Maya just brings up a really good point that somebody has to mine the data, somebody has to ask questions of the data. And just like we're finding that algorithms are biased, like this is the same thing. Like we have to question everything. So yes, Maya.
Yeah, can we say like crime data is the perfect example. It is the perfect example of how biased data can be. I mean, when you're talking about, even let's look at the stop data that we just analyzed and all the disparities that we had found, even within that sliver of data. Can you imagine though, how many disparities we would find if we had the full sample of all the individuals that police officers saw engaging in whatever and decided not to stop them? That's the full picture of data. And we never get it. We never get it. And so I really do, I can't like clap enough for the fact that we really do have to be careful. I mean, data is a fantastic tool. I love it. I think a lot of people on this panel love it. But we do have to recognize the limitations of data and ensure that we are doing our due diligence to make sure that we are telling the fullest story possible.
And Lyndsay, to your point about that, I mean, that's the police reporting the data. And if the police, you look at any department that has been audited, one problem that comes up time again is their reporting. We're asking men and women who aren't journalists to report what's happening. And of course, they're going to report it in a way that makes them look like they're performing their job well. I mean, use of force is a problem with police departments across the country, and they're self-reporting that, which means they're under-reporting that use of force. So yes, that's a good point about data.
Yeah, and they track it in really crappy ways locally. I mean, even when they are self-reporting, they're not just self-reporting very well.
Melissa?
My last point is, well, even federally. So we just saw this weekend, here's an actual news example. This weekend, there was a boat that was carrying dozens of people. It crashed, several people died immediately. It was Border Patrol was responding to this. Border Patrol shares a statistic. This had attention of national, local news media, everyone. Okay, this is a perfect example of a breaking news story. And they shared that, yes, in fact, a lot of these apprehensions and a lot of border crossings are up in a lot of different fashions, including this underwater. Okay, well, why? If it's up dramatically within 6 months, you can report that fact by also reporting that we were just in a pandemic, that there was economic and there was social changes in our communities, and as to why there is this surge, why represents those numbers, and then you move forward. And I think it's easy to do on a breaking news day-to-day situation. You don't have to take, I don't see it that it has to take 2 weeks to be like, oh, this is some data story that we're looking into. Just immediately providing context, then following up. And that's even done in a day-to-day television cycle.
Awesome. Well, we're almost at our end here, but just two more questions I wanted to get out there. One from the chat, and then one that kind of occurred to me. One thing that it's come up in different components at this time when we talked about, parsing through the data, particularly with Asian Americans, right? I know I have a buddy who always points out to me that the wealth gap is a lot, greater if you actually get into it. But generally speaking, I feel like there's a tendency in a lot of news coverage to view, in particular, Latinos and Asian Americans as monoliths. And I'm wondering, what would you guys recommend, or how do you think news organizations go about, breaking that down and going a little deeper? Maya?
Well, I think this is where, I think journalists really have to kind of stop relying on data, because the data is really problematic and doesn't give you a lot of information, particularly with Latinos, well, with a lot of groups, but API is obviously one that's near and dear to me, and pretty egregious because there's like dozens of different nationalities and languages and experiences. But I think that is where really sourcing is important, sourcing within those communities, so that you are in touch with people who have different experiences. And when you look at data, you can say, okay, well, this might be a little bit different. Let me talk to, my Indian sources and my Filipino sources and my Vietnamese sources and see how they're experiencing like this one crisis or this one issue, so that we can really distinguish, their experiences in different ways. It's not an easy thing to do, I think, but sourcing is just like a part of a reporter's job. And I think that in particular with these communities, it's really, really important because data can be really, really limiting. And it can really, really simplify people's experiences and even erase some people's experiences.
Thank you. Well, I guess the last question that popped up in the chat here, which is one that I think all of us will have to deal with in some capacity if we ever want to see kind of wholesale change, is just how do we get more managers of color in newsrooms? And someone mentioned SBJ San Diego just sent out a survey, but we're looking at how can we make a difference in doing that. I don't know if any of you guys have any ideas. Otis?
Sure. The New York Times just started a fellowship, much like it did its fellowship for reporting, where it's actively seeking. It's kind of like, I remember a couple of years ago when there was this pressure on the big tech companies to have more people of color, more women of color on staff. And Mark Zuckerberg said that, oh, well, there just aren't any. And I remember I approached him at some gala dinner and I was like, why don't you train them? You have all this money. Why don't you recruit and train? And it's the same thing with editors of color. It's the same thing with more women in positions of power. 50% of the population, we're here. Just ask, set up that pipeline. I think we'll begin to see, particularly in places like California, where so much of the population is non-white, that news organizations that do survive will have to recruit or create that pipeline. And that's something that I'm very committed to at KQED, is to, if you're saying we don't have enough Black people, well, I'll go find them for you and I'll bring them in. The same thing. I feel that this level I am as a journalist, it's incumbent upon me to reach back and bring others along. And I do that because I feel that all of our reporting will be stronger if we have more voices, more perspectives. I feel that in Atlanta, if we had different perspectives in the news-making process, news-making decision process, we wouldn't have written a story that suggested that the people who were in those, who were at those spas, it was their fault as if Georgia legislators had done enough to close them. If we would have had someone to say, hey, man, to Christina's point, which is, what do you think someone who is from this community read this? How are they going to feel? Instead, it's, this is how I feel. And when you have most of, when the voices that are in the room, the decision-making room are white, you tend to get stuff that's problematic, that isn't representative of the audience or the population you're serving.
Christina.
Yeah, I just think another part of it too, and thinking about that pipeline, is a little separate, but it's about working on retention. It's about making sure that your newsrooms stay diverse, because what we've seen time and time again is that those entry-level jobs are the ones that you see the most journalists of color in, the most women, the most LGBTQ, everything is at, the beginning. But then what happens as time goes on? People leave. They have bad experiences with editors. They're not moving up the pipeline. And so then there you go. We need to concentrate on keeping the talent in newsrooms, and that's going to involve structurally changing. And I think a lot of that is training, entice them to stay by giving them training and leveling up.
Yeah, I mean, I think that just to piggyback off of that, I think that that's such an important point. And, I think structurally, media organizations sort of need to do a better job at sort of crafting paths for advancement in general, right? I think that that's just not something that we're very good at in this industry. I mean, there's a lot of stagnation depending on the kind of media organization that you work with. There's not a lot of movement, but I think that you need to be thoughtful about that if you are going to, as Christina said, cultivate that talent and make sure that they feel seen and heard and are able to do their best work.
I also think that a big part of it is re-examining what newsrooms look for when they look at candidates. Because I think that a lot of times newsrooms are looking for, or they'll say, well, we just want a good writer or something like that. And they don't ever say, well, this person has a different experience because they grew up as this race, they grew up in this community, and that perspective is something we want to pay for. That perspective is something we want in this management position. It's something we value. It's something we value in this reporter's angle and stuff like that. So I think that sort of changing just the perspective of how we view candidates and what is valuable is really important, and how we view employees and what they bring to the table and what is valuable is a major shift that needs to happen. And I also think that news organizations need to start thinking about their audience in a different way, and that will shift a lot of their hiring decisions and their coverage decisions and things like that. If you're thinking about an audience first in San Diego County, for example, and you're trying to reach everyone, your coverage in your newsroom is going to end up looking a lot different than if you're just focusing on reaching who you've been reaching, but having them give you more money or more clicks. So I think that it really involves a mindset shift of what we value as an industry and as organizations.
Melissa, do you want to add something?
Sure. I just like to mention how Donna Stewart, one of our phenomenal news managers, thank you, Donna. She works at NBC 7 and Telemundo 20. That is watching all of us. She writes in the comments, yes, NBC Universal is taking active stance on finding people of color for management roles. And this is true because under our company, one of our leaders, Cesar Conde, he has announced a 50-50 percentage of making sure that women and people of color are advanced and continue to be advanced. And this is within all of NBC Universal. So from folks that work and manage theme parks to movies to our newsrooms. And so those decisions are critical, and it's huge for obviously such a mainstream company as well.
Awesome. Well, guys, thank you so much. I think we really pressed it up against the time here, but I think it was well worth it. And I want to thank all our panelists for taking time after hours here to do this. I think it was really informative. I know it certainly was for me. And also to all of you guys out there who decided to join us. Again, I can't thank you enough, because the only way you'll ever see this stuff addressed is if people are engaging in these kind of conversations collaboratively. So thank you. And I guess, yeah, with that, farewell.
night. Thank you.